You want to talk about potential? Fine. The boy has potential. The same potential every kid from Rexdale has. The potential to end up exactly where he started. David Marsh said it at his own dining room table, in the voice he used for quarterly board reviews, and he did not lower it because he did not believe anyone in the room deserved that consideration. His daughter was sitting across from him. The boy he was talking about was standing in the hallway, still holding his coat, because no one had told him to sit down. His name was Elijah Cole. He was 22 years old. He had taken 2 buses to get there. David Marsh picked up his fork and resumed eating, and that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. 3 years later, Elijah bought the building David Marsh had spent his whole career trying to get his name on. Toronto in late October smelled of wet pavement and wood smoke, and the particular cold that comes off Lake Ontario when the season has made up its mind. Elijah noticed it the morning he came back, sitting in the passenger seat of a contractor's van heading north on the Gardiner, watching the city reassemble itself through a rain-streaked window. He had left in winter. He came back in autumn, which felt correct to him in ways he didn't spend time examining. The Halcyon was a mixed-use tower on Bay Street that had been stalled in development for 4 years, first by financing problems, then by a change in city council, then by the particular rot that sets in when a project is managed by people who are better at acquiring things than finishing them. The Marsh Group had taken it over 18 months ago as a flagship development, the kind of project that was meant to announce something about the family's ambitions. The kind of project that required, in David Marsh's words at a planning meeting Elijah had read the minutes of, people who actually know how to use their hands. Elijah had made sure his application said exactly that and nothing larger. The site foreman barely looked up when he handed over the paperwork. Trade certificate, 2 years of general contracting references that led to phone numbers answered by people who owed him favors. A work history as clean and unremarkable as a blank wall. By 8 in the morning, he had a hard hat and a set of floor plans and a badge that let him into the service elevator. By 9, he had seen her. Isabel Marsh was standing at the far end of the 4th-floor corridor with a rolled set of drawings tucked under one arm and her phone pressed to her ear, and for a moment the 3 years between them collapsed entirely and she was the same person. Then she turned toward the window to catch the light, and she was not. She was sharper now, the kind of sharpness that comes from spending years in a room where everyone is waiting to see if you'll ask for help. She wore her authority the way people do when they've had to fight to be taken seriously in their own family's company, carefully and with both hands. She saw him a second later. The drawings slipped an inch and she caught them. He watched her run the math. The hard hat, the work boots, the badge clipped to a canvas jacket, 2 sizes too worn to be new. He watched her try to fit the person she remembered into the shape of a construction worker on her family's building and fail, and he watched something in her eyes break very quietly, trying. Elijah. She said it like a question she hadn't meant to ask out loud. Mrs. Marsh. He said it the way you say a client's name on a job site, and he saw the formality arrive like something she hadn't braced for. She crossed the corridor too fast. Up close, she smelled like cedar and cold air, and he noted it and set it aside the way he had learned to set things aside. Deliberately, like folding a letter you're not ready to throw out. What are you doing here? Working, he said. You're not. She stopped. Lowered her voice. This is my family's building. I know, he said. Somebody has to hang the drywalling on 12. Her jaw tightened. She studied his hands. He let her. 3 years of a certain kind of life had put real calluses on his palms, not performed ones, because Elijah had never believed in a disguise you couldn't shake someone's hand through. I heard you moved out west. I did. And you came back to, she gestured at the corridor, at the half-finished walls, at the floor gritty with plaster dust. Yep, he said. A man in a fleece vest appeared at the end of the hall and called her name. She looked at Elijah once more, and there was a question in it she didn't have the standing to ask out loud. Then she went toward the man in the vest, and Elijah went back to the floor plans, and the morning continued as if nothing in it had shifted. That evening, a black sedan picked him up on Richmond Street 2 blocks from the motel where he was pretending to live. The driver said nothing. In the back seat, Elijah took out the phone that was not the cheap one he carried on site and made a single call. "Where are we on the remaining tranche?" he said. The voice on the other end belonged to his lawyer, a woman named Petra Hollins, who had been there since the beginning. She had been there when the supply chain software he'd coded in a shared apartment in Calgary had turned into a licensing deal. She had been there when the deal had turned into the thing that made the real money, the logistics patent that half the major freight operators between Montreal and Vancouver had ended up paying to use, the one that had turned a broke 22-year-old into someone whose net worth made people uncomfortable when they learned how quickly it had happened. She had been there when the money became the kind of money that requires a different kind of lawyer. She told him the numbers. He listened. He told her to keep the fund's name off everything, the way he always did, and she told him she always did, the way she always did. There had been a small item in the Globe and Mail's business section the previous week, buried on a Tuesday, about an unnamed private fund acquiring distressed commercial real estate debt across the Greater Toronto area. No reporter had identified who was behind it. Isabel Marsh would not have read it. Almost no one had. But it was there, the way a seam is there in a wall, waiting for the right pressure. Elijah had not planned for the complications that found him. He had come back to watch the Marsh Group's flagship project come apart from the inside, because he knew better than anyone alive exactly how close to the edge the family's finances were stretched. He had come back to be holding the paper when the building finally went under. He had not come back for anything else, and he had spent 3 years making sure he meant that. Then he found Dale Coburn's invoices. It happened while he was pulling permit records for a structural question on the 9th floor, and the permits didn't match the change orders, and the change orders didn't match the payments, and once he started following the gap, it opened into something much larger. Dale Coburn was the Marsh Group's project financial officer, David Marsh's cousin, installed in the role because David trusted family above everything else, which was one of the things that made David Marsh dangerous, and one of the things that made him a fool. Dale had been padding the Halcyon's construction budget for the better part of a year. Phantom subcontractors, approved invoices for work that existed only on paper, change orders signed off by a man whose signature no one questioned because his last name was the same as the building's owner. It was not clever. It was patient, and patient had been enough, because the only person above Dale was David, and David did not read ledgers. David read rooms, and he had long since decided that his cousin was loyal, which in David Marsh's vocabulary was the same word as safe. For Elijah, it was a gift. He understood that the moment he saw it. Dale's theft was a fault line running directly under the Halcyon's foundations, and the Halcyon was the last thing holding the Marsh Group's debt load above water. He didn't have to bring anything down. He only had to let Dale keep digging and position the fund correctly, and be there when the floor gave out. The problem was Isabel, because when the Halcyon fell, and it would fall, it would not be David Marsh who answered for the missing money. David would find a way to land on someone else's back, the way David always had. It would be Isabel, the project manager of record, the name on the construction oversight documents, the one who had been handed authority without being handed information, the way you hand someone the wheel without mentioning the brakes don't work. Elijah stood in a half-gutted mechanical room on the 7th floor with a folder of fabricated invoices in his hand, and discovered that he could not feel good about that. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that for 2 days. On the 3rd, he wrote the analysis. He did it the way he did everything now, clean, complete, arranged, so that the pattern could not be argued with. 2 years of fraudulent billing, vendor names with no corporate registration, payments routed through holding companies that dissolved within months of receiving them. Anyone who read it would understand within 3 pages exactly what Dale Coburn had done and approximately how much he had taken. It was the kind of work that should have taken a forensic accountant 6 weeks. Elijah did it in a night because numbers had always felt to him like a first language. one he'd been fluent in since he was doing his mother's bookkeeping at the kitchen table in Rexdale at 15. He left it on Isabel's desk in the site trailer, unsigned, a single line at the top in his own handwriting. Start with the vendor registrations. He told himself it was carelessness. It was not. A man who had hidden a fund from an entire city does not forget to hide a sentence by accident. He wanted her to know it was him. He chose not to examine why. She found it the next morning. He was on the 6th floor when he saw her through the window, picking up the pages from her desk. He watched her go still. He watched her read the line at the top. He watched her look up and scan the site through the trailer window, and he stepped back from the glass before her eyes could find him. She did not come to him directly. That was the first thing that told him something had changed. 3 years ago, she would have come straight at him, all hurt and heat, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. Instead, she pulled her own copies of the vendor files. She cross-referenced the invoices against city permit records. She built the case herself, brick by independent brick, so that when she moved, she would be standing on her own evidence and not on his word. He had given her a thread. She wove a rope with it. On the 4th day, she called Dale Coburn and the project's 2 senior site supervisors into the trailer. Elijah positioned himself near the open window with a spirit level in his hand and a reason to be there. "I'm putting the Halcyon's vendor contracts on hold," Isabel said. Her voice was level. "All of them. Everything goes back to tender." Dale's voice climbed. "You don't have the authority. I'm the project manager. The contracts go through me and they come out through me. A beat. Every vendor reapplies. Every invoice from the last 14 months gets reviewed. If the work was done and done properly, there's nothing to worry about. Your father approved these arrangements, S. Then my father will want to understand why several of the vendors who invoiced us don't appear to exist." The trailer went quiet. Elijah stood in the construction dust outside and understood that she had just done the thing that couldn't be undone. She hadn't gone to David first. She hadn't managed the family's face. She had chosen the principle over the name, in a family where the name was the only currency anyone respected, and she had stepped directly into her father's path doing it. He should have felt the satisfaction of a plan advancing. The crack he had come to widen was widening now. Instead, he felt the thread between them pull taut. She came out of the trailer 10 minutes later, with the folder in her hand, and walked straight across the site toward him, not caring who saw. "I know it's you," she said quietly, stopping in front of him. "The handwriting, I'd know it anywhere. What I don't know is what you are now." He looked at her, at the woman who had just set fire to her own standing in the family company, using a match he had handed her. "Neither do I," he said. "Not completely. Not anymore." David Marsh heard about the voided contracts before noon, and by that evening he had made up his mind about the cause. Wade's hands had done it, but the contractor's hands were where the root was. In 40 years of business, David had built his instincts by reading one thing above everything else: who had motive. The Halcyon was his family's most important asset. Someone on the inside had handed his daughter information she shouldn't have had. His daughter had used it to blow up 18 months of approved vendor relationships. That someone was a plant, a fixer, a man sent in by a larger interest to soften the project up from the inside before moving to take it. He did not consider the possibility that the laborer was the larger interest. The architecture of his entire life made that impossible. He had Dale pull the employment records. He made calls to people who answered his calls. What came back about the contractor named Elijah Cole was, on its surface, nothing. A clean work history. References that checked out. No record, no debt, no story. And a man with no story, in David Marsh's considerable experience, was the most expensive kind. He arrived at the Halcyon himself 3 days later, which he never did, and found grievances. The millwork on 14 was behind schedule. A worker had been seen in the site trailer after hours. The hard hat signage on the east stairwell wasn't up to code. He had Dale reject Elijah's framing work on 12 and order it redone. He replaced the foreman with someone who took direction from the family office. He tightened the screws the only way he knew, by making a man's days small and grinding and waiting for him to walk. Elijah did not walk. He redid the framing without complaint. Better than the first time. He was there before anyone else each morning and the last to leave each evening, and his steadiness unnerved David in a way that open defiance would not have, because David had built his whole career on knowing what a man would do when pressed. This one did the thing David had not accounted for. He simply held. What David Marsh did not allow anyone to see, what he had not allowed anyone to see in 30 years, was where his certainty had come from originally. He had been 28 when the family company nearly died. His own father had still been nominally in charge, and into the firm had come a man named Terence Gill, who had nothing and a brilliant way of talking about everything. David had believed him. His father had believed him more. Terence had been given access, then trust, then signing authority. By the time the family understood what was happening, Terence had been drawing down the firm's credit lines for 8 months, and the money had gone somewhere no one could follow. David had spent the next 15 years pulling the company back by its roots. He had learned one lesson from it and learned it all the way through. A man who comes to you with nothing and a beautiful mouth is the most dangerous thing that can walk through your door, because he has no reason not to take everything you have. It was not a lesson about race. David told himself that. He had colleagues of every background. He had signed checks to people from every community in this city. What he feared was hunger, and hunger did not discriminate. But across 30 years, the lesson and the fear had fused somewhere he could no longer locate the seam, and what he saw when he looked at Elijah Cole, young, black, penniless, looking at his daughter the way Terence Gill had once looked at the company's books, was a man who had not yet stolen anything. And David had thrown wine on a dinner table 3 years ago to get him out the door before he could. He had not felt cruel. He had felt like a man pulling his family back from a ledge. That he might have been wrong was a thought he had never once let himself finish. He did not let himself finish it now. He changed the board instead. Without consulting Isabel, David announced that the Marsh Group would be entering into a strategic partnership with the Callahan family. Old Toronto money. A son named Bryce who was agreeable and safe and entirely without appetite for things that weren't his. And that Isabel would be joining the Callahan family at a fundraiser gala the following week in a capacity that was, David said, both professional and personal. He presented it at dinner as a decision already made. Isabel's face went white and then very still. "You don't decide that," she said. "I've already made the arrangements," David said. "Bryce is a good man, easy to respect if you give it time. I'm not a business arrangement." "Everything is an arrangement," David said, and he said it not cruelly but with the exhausted patience of a man who has been repeating the same truth for decades. "The only variable is who does the arranging. I watched this company come within a signature of dying once, and I will not watch it happen again because you've decided to play at loyalty with a man who hangs drywalling." Isabel put down her fork. She left the table. She left the house. She drove through the city in the dark, east along the waterfront, past the towers and the docked boats and the particular loneliness of the lakeshore, at 11 o'clock on a weeknight. And she found that her hands had taken her somewhere specific. Elijah opened the door of the rented house near Leslieville before she knocked. He had heard the car. He stood in the doorway in a plain gray shirt, no work jacket, and for a moment neither of them said anything. 3 years of things unsaid stacked in the hall between them. "He's marrying me off," Isabel said. Her voice did not shake, and the steadiness of it was its own kind of breaking. "To Bryce Callahan. He's already called their family. He just decided." "Come in," Elijah said. She did. The house was sparse, almost nothing personal anywhere in it. She didn't notice because she was already past noticing things that weren't the things she'd driven across the city to say. "3 years ago, I let him win," she said, standing in the middle of the small front room. "I stood there and I let him say what he said and I didn't do anything. I was 21. Every dollar I had came from him. The whole world was his company and none of it was mine, and I have hated myself for it since." She looked at him directly. "I am not doing it again. I don't care what it costs." Elijah looked at her and the careful professional distance he had maintained since the hallway on 4. The foreman's formality, The level voice, all of it, came apart in his hands. "I never blamed you for that night," he said. "You were a kid in his house. I blamed him. I have blamed him every day for 3 years." He stopped because the next part was true and he hadn't meant to say it yet. "I came back to make him pay for it." "I know," she said. "I've known since I read your handwriting. That doesn't frighten you." "What frightens me," she said, "is that you came all this way and didn't tell me you were here." She crossed the small distance between them. "You were going to do all of it without me." "I didn't come back for you," he said. He said it plainly, because she deserved plain things, and because he needed to know whether it would send her back out the door. "I came back for him. You were the part I didn't plan for." Whatever he had expected, it was not the way she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, the way someone does when they need to know if a thing is real. "Then plan for me now," she said. What came after was not the drama of two strangers. It was the quiet, wrecking recognition of two people who had spent 3 years learning to live around the absence of something, discovering all at once that they had never actually managed it. The hurt did not disappear. It only stopped being a wall between them and became instead something they stood on the same side of. For a long time after, neither of them said anything that needed words. Later, in the dark, Elijah almost told her everything. The truth was right at the front of his mouth. The fund, the debt positions, the 3 years of quiet acquisition, the percentage of the Marsh Group's outstanding debt that now sat in a single holding company under his fund's control. He almost said all of it, and then he felt the shape of how it would sound, that he had engineered everything, that even this moment, her hand on his face, her driving across the city in the dark, could be folded into the machinery of what he'd built. He understood, lying there, that the truth had become something different without his noticing. For 3 years it had been a weapon, kept sheathed for the right moment. Now holding her, it had become something that could wound her specifically. A weapon you cannot use without hurting the person you're trying to protect has stopped being a weapon. It's only a secret. And secrets, Elijah was learning, are heavier than anything you can carry in a pocket. He said nothing. He told himself there would be a better moment. There almost never is. The Marsh Group's annual stakeholder reception was held 3 weeks later at a private event space in Yorkville, and David Marsh used it the way he used everything, to make the family's strength visible to people who measured strength by visibility. Isabel attended because not attending would have been a declaration she wasn't ready to make in public. Elijah came because she asked him to, and because he had stopped pretending, at least to himself, that he was only there to hang drywalling. David found him near the far end of the room, away from the string quartet and the canapes, exactly as he had found him 3 years ago at a different table in a different city, with the same certainty and the same folded check. "I'll be direct," David said, "since you seem to appreciate that." He held out the envelope. "I don't know who sent you, and at this point I don't particularly care. This is more than they're paying you. Take it, finish whatever job you came to do somewhere away from my family, and we consider the matter closed." He held it out between them. 3 years ago, a moment like that had broken something in Elijah and sent him out into the cold. He had replayed it 1,000 times since, and in every version he had said something that cut, something that left a mark. He had built 3 years of quiet work around the shape of what he would say when this moment came again. He looked at the envelope. Then he looked at David Marsh, really looked at him, at the fear dressed up as contempt, at a man holding a piece of paper as if money were a fence that could keep the world the shape he'd decided it should be. "There's no number, Mr. Marsh," he said. "There was never going to be a number." He left the envelope in David's hand. He did not raise his voice. "You should hold on to that. You're going to want everything liquid very soon." He walked away then, back toward the light and the room, and left David standing at the edge of his own party with his hand still extended, feeling, for the first time in 30 years, the floor of a room shift under him without knowing which way it was going to fall. David went home and did not sleep. And while he did not sleep, he did the one thing left to a frightened man with institutional power. He moved first. By morning he had assembled, quietly, through favors and through fear. Enough votes on the Marsh Group's board to do what he should have done weeks ago. He would strip Isabel of her operating authority, effective immediately. He would sell the Halcyon at any price to any buyer before whatever was circling could close. He would burn the asset himself rather than surrender it. He believed, genuinely, that it was the only move left. Elijah got the call before 6 in the morning. Petra Hollins's voice was flat and fast. David had the votes. The board meeting was at 8. By 9, Isabel would be removed. The Halcyon would go to a buyer David had already identified, at a price that would wipe out 3 years of patient positioning, and none of what Elijah had built would matter because the one thing he had never been able to acquire was time. And David Marsh had just taken the last of it. There was only one way to stop it. He had spent 3 years making sure no one in Toronto knew his name. To save Isabel, he would have to walk into that boardroom and tell all of them exactly who he was, and accept that she, watching him reveal a fortune he had kept from her through every honest moment between them, might never again believe that any of it had been real. He sat in the early dark with the phone in his hand. "Tell them I'm coming," he said. The Marsh Group board met in a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor of a building on Adelaide Street, and at 8 o'clock, David Marsh took the chair at the head of the table as if the morning already belonged to him. It nearly did. He had the room and he knew it. The faces around the table were people whose families had done business with the Marshes for decades, people who owed David or feared him, or simply found it easier to be on the side that won. Dale Coburn sat to his right, pale and useful. Isabel sat halfway down the table alone, a single folder in front of her, no visible allies. David called the meeting to order and read, in a voice as even as a deposition, the resolution removing Isabel Marsh from all operating authority within the company, effective immediately, on the grounds of project mismanagement and unilateral voiding of approved vendor agreements. When he finished, he looked at his daughter with something that was nearly tender. The look of a man doing something hard for reasons he believed were good. "This isn't punishment," he said. "One day you'll understand what it is. 3 years ago, Isabel would have gone quiet. 2 months ago, she might have." She opened the folder. "Before the board votes," she said, "they should know what they're voting on. The matter isn't. The matter is mismanagement," she said, and her voice carried down the table without rising. "So let's look at the management." She slid copies along the table. The board members took them carefully, the way people handle things they aren't sure they want to be holding. "These are the Halcyon's vendor contracts for the past 14 months. These are the invoices. These are the city permits and inspection records for the work those invoices claim was completed." A pause. "I'd like someone to explain why we paid $94,000 to a millwork company with no registered address, no employees, and no HST number. I voided those contracts because they were fraudulent. If that's the mismanagement I'm being removed for, I'd like the minutes to say exactly what I was managing." The room changed temperature. Dale had gone the color of old plaster. 2 of the longer-serving board members were already turning pages with quiet, focused frowns. A man named Jasper Holden, silver-haired and careful, who had known the Marsh family for 25 years, looked up slowly. "David," he said, "were you aware of this?" "My daughter is deflecting from." "Dale's contracts can be reviewed separately," Holden said. "The question on this table just changed." It was not a victory. Isabel knew that even as she watched it land, she did not have the votes. She had only made the votes uncomfortable, turned a proceeding into a question, bought herself a few minutes of uncertainty in a room that had walked in already decided. But she had done it with her own hands, her own evidence, her own case. That was when the door opened. Elijah walked in, and for a moment the room did not know how to place him, because the man who came through the door did not match any version of him that belonged in this building. He was not in a work jacket. He wore a dark suit that had been cut for him by someone who cuts very few suits, the kind of clothing that does not announce money because it has never had to. He crossed the room with the ease of a man who had been in 100 rooms exactly like it, and the ease arrived before anyone understood anything else. David recovered first. This is a closed session. I don't know how you got past. Mr. Marsh. The voice that interrupted him came from the woman who had followed Elijah through the door, a precise figure in a charcoal blazer, carrying a leather case that she set on the table with a small, final sound. My name is Petra Hollins. I'm counsel to the controlling interest in the entities that currently hold the Marsh Group's outstanding construction debt. My client asked me to be present before the board took any votes this morning. I'd recommend you hear what I have to say. She opened the case. She did not hurry. She laid out the documents the way Elijah had taught her to lay out everything, so the pattern could not be argued with. Acquisition records, assignment of notes, 3 years of a single private fund purchasing the Marsh Group's distressed real estate debt, one position at a time, across a dozen different instruments, never loudly, never traceable to a single name, until the debt no longer lived with scattered creditors across Bay Street, but with one. Then she laid the last document flat on the table, the one that made Jasper Holden sit back slowly in his chair, the one establishing that the fund had converted that debt and acquired sufficient open market positions to hold a voting stake in the Marsh Group that no one else at the table came close to matching. As of the close of business yesterday, Petra said, my client holds 49.1% of the voting interest in this company. That is the single largest position at this table. It exceeds the family block Mr. Marsh assembled overnight, which sits at approximately 34%. Any resolution this board passes this morning does so at my client's discretion. The silence was total. David's eyes moved from the lawyer to the man in the dark suit, and the arithmetic he had trusted for 30 years collapsed all at once, because there was only one conclusion left, and it was the one his entire career had told him was not possible. Who? David said. His voice had lost its floor. Who is your client? You've met him, Petra said. 3 years ago, at your dinner table. Elijah stepped forward. He did not smile. You looked into me, he said. You found a fund buying distressed debt and a contractor standing near it, and you just decided I was someone else's errand. You couldn't make the other answer fit because the other answer meant a man you dismissed with a check in an envelope had walked back into your building holding more of it than you do. He let David hold it. No one sent me. I built it myself. Every dollar. Starting the week after you told me I had no business dreaming about your daughter. He turned to the table. I'm calling the vote my counsel referenced. 2 items. First, the resolution removing Isabel Marsh from operating authority is withdrawn. The conduct cited, identifying and exposing fraudulent vendor billing, is the reason this company still has a building to board meet in. Second, he looked at David, and for one moment a dinner table in another city passed between them. I'm exercising my voting interest to remove David Marsh as chair of this board, effective now. Holden called the vote because someone's had to, and the room voted the only way the numbers permitted it to vote, one name at a time. When it was done, David Marsh sat at the head of a table that was no longer his. It should have been the moment Elijah had built 3 years around. He had imagined it in 100 different versions. The look on David's face when he understood. The satisfaction of it. The satisfaction did not come, because the only face in the room he actually cared about was Isabel's, and Isabel was looking at him as if she had never seen him before. He understood immediately. He had known this was coming. She was doing the arithmetic. The fund, the years, the spare house near Leslieville that had told her nothing because it had been designed to tell her nothing. The man who had said, come in and plan for me now while holding a 49% secret behind his back. The board was filing out. Dale had already gone. Petra gathered her case and made herself absent in the way good lawyers can. And in the emptying room, Isabel stood and faced him across the long table. How long, she said. 3 years. Since the week after the dinner. The house. There's nothing in it. Not a question. No. That night I drove across the city. Her voice was level, and that was worse than if it hadn't been. I told you I was done being decided for. I said I didn't care what it cost. And you already had all of this. She gestured at the table, the documents, the wreckage of her father at the head of it. You let me think I was choosing, freely. You let me feel brave. And I was just walking into the last scene of something you'd already written. There it was, the exact wound. laid out in her own words. He could have softened it. He had the kind of resources that buy very good softening. He didn't. I came back to take him down, Elijah said. That's real. I'm not going to stand here and tell you the plan wasn't real because you'd know I was lying and I'm done lying to you by omission. He came around the table slowly, giving her room to step back. She didn't. I didn't tell you about the fund because by the time I wanted to, it had stopped being a weapon and started being something that could hurt you specifically. I kept waiting for a better moment and I was wrong to wait. That's my failure, not yours. Then, why didn't you let him win this morning? She said. You had your revenge the second you walked through that door. You didn't need to save my position to take his. No, he agreed. I didn't. He reached for the single document Petra had set aside from the case, and he slid across the table to her. That's a voting proxy, he said. It assigns the full decision-making power of my 49.1% to you. Not the debt ownership. I'm not going to pretend I'm handing you the money. The fund stays because I built it, and because it's the only thing keeping this company out of worse hands than mine right now. But the votes. Every material decision the Marsh Group makes from this point forward, it makes through you. He met her eyes. I spent 3 years building the one thing large enough to take your father's power away from him. I am not going to turn it around and use it to control you the way he controlled you your whole life. That's the difference. It's the only way I know how to show you the difference. Isabel looked at the document for a long time. Then she looked at him. The proof was not in anything he had said because anyone can say anything. It was in the page in front of her. You do not hand someone the exact instrument you spent 3 years acquiring if you are still playing the game. She had run enough of her father's world to understand what power costs. She was looking at a man setting his down on the table with his hand open. You should have told me, she said, that night. You should have told me and trusted me to still choose you. I know. You didn't trust it. No, he said. After 3 years of carrying it, I didn't believe one true sentence could survive in the same room as all of that. I was wrong. That's on me. She picked up the pen. Across the room, David Marsh had not moved. He had heard all of it, and what came apart in him now was not the loss of the chair. That was already gone, but something underneath it. The lesson he had organized his whole life around. That a man who comes to you with nothing and a way of talking will always, in the end, take. Calvin Reese had walked into his father's company with empty hands and walked out carrying the family's future in a bag. Elijah Cole had walked into his with the family's future already in his possession and was standing in front of him giving it away. For 30 years, David had been certain he was protecting Isabel from men like this. He had spent the whole time unable to distinguish the one man who would not take from the kind that would. The cost of that mistake was sitting in the silence of the room. I was wrong about you, David said. The words came out of him like something pulled up by the root. They were not gracious. He had not had to learn gracious. But they were true, and everyone remaining in the room understood what they cost him. I was wrong about you the night I threw you out, and I have been wrong about you since. Elijah looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. You were. He did not say it to wound. There was nothing left that wounding could do. But you raised her, and whatever else you got wrong, you didn't get her wrong. She walked into this room this morning and built a case that saved this company before I ever came through the door. You taught her to be hard enough to stand against you. That turned out to be the only thing that mattered, even if you didn't mean it as a gift. Isabel signed the proxy. She set the pen down. She looked at her father across the wreckage of the morning. What passed between them was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first ground cleared enough that forgiveness might one day find a place to stand. 8 months later, the Halcyon opened. The hoarding came down on a morning in early June, and the building stood in the clean Toronto light looking the way its original plans had promised, and the Marsh Group's finances had never quite allowed it to. Isabel ran the company, and she ran it through her own decisions and her own signature. And the board that had once assembled to remove her now waited to hear what she thought before moving. She had not been handed that. She had built it. Everyone who mattered in that room knew the difference. David kept a small office in the building. Isabel had insisted on it over Elijah's measured objection and her father's stiff silence. A quiet role, no operational authority. A place at the edge of something that had once been entirely his. He took it because the alternative was nothing, and slowly, the way someone learns a language later in life, imperfectly and then with growing ease, he began to look at the man his daughter had chosen and see only the man. Not the neighborhood he'd come from, or the empty bank account he'd arrived with, or the fear David had dressed up for 30 years and called foresight. On the evening of the building's opening, Elijah and Isabel stood together in the lobby atrium, slightly apart from the guests and the noise. The building rose above them, finished at last, and through the tall windows the city went on being the city. The lake just visible in the distance, the lights coming on in the towers across the water. "You gave me the votes," Isabel said. "You could have run all of it. Most people would have." "I didn't build it to run it," Elijah said. "I built it to put it down in front of you." He took her hand, and there was no distance left in it, no careful formality, no carpenter, no secret, no version of himself he was protecting from scrutiny. "I spent 3 years thinking I came back to take something from your father," he said. "Turned as out I came back to give something to you. I just had to lose almost everything. I thought I wanted to figure out which one it actually was." They stood in the lobby of a building that had once been a symbol of everything keeping them apart. And it was that no longer, and there was nothing in the world left between them but the future, the one neither of them had to ask anyone's permission to walk into.